I called my wife's lover while they were together and said cruelly, "The divorce is on the way." The line went dead. Absolute silence. A silence that I could feel on the other side, a silence filled with fear, guilt and surprise. I knew exactly what was happening at that moment. The two of them were there, together, in the bed that was once sacred to me and her. The same bed where we promised loyalty to each other, where we said words of love countless times. Now it was desecrated, stained by the betrayal that crushed me inside. And they knew it. They knew I had discovered everything. That I was no longer the naive man who slept peacefully while my wife shamelessly cheated on me. But what they didn't know, was what I would do next. The silence on the other end of the line dissolved into a hesitant whisper. She called my name, as if trying to understand if it was real. As if he expected it to be a nightmare. But it wasn't. I felt her desperation through the call, as if I could see her lost gaze, her skin crawling, her heart racing with fear of what would come next. Her lover, a coward, was probably already starting to break out in a cold sweat, thinking about the consequences. But I wouldn't give them the relief of knowing what they would be. Uncertainty would be my initial revenge. The phone fell. What were they doing at that time? Did he get dressed in a hurry, tripping over his own clothes, trying to escape my name, my warning? What could happen? Did she hold his arm, begging him to stay? Or did he burst into tears, imagining that the world he built in secret was about to fall apart? I didn't care. I didn't need to be there to see it. The image was already burned into my mind as if I was watching the scene unfold before my eyes. I already knew what happened in moments like this. I knew that the fear of the truth always outweighs the excitement of sin. I was not an impulsive man. I'm not the type to act without thinking. But in that instant, everything I was ceased to exist. I was no longer the understanding husband. I was no longer the fool who waited for his wife to get home late from work, blindly trusting her lame excuses. I was the betrayed man. The man who discovered everything. The man who carried the weight of years of lies on his shoulders, crushing every trace of love that ever existed. And I wouldn't let it go without consequences. My mind was spinning. How did I not notice before? How was I so blind? All the nights she dressed up more than usual for work dinners, all the messages she quickly deleted from her cell phone, the fake smiles, the hasty kisses. The signs were there the whole time, screaming in my face, but I chose to ignore them. Because I loved it. Because I trusted. But now, all I felt was disgust. Disgusted at having been deceived. Disgusted for having shared my life, my home, my soul with a woman who did not have the dignity to respect me. I got up and looked around. Our home. The house we built together. The pictures on the wall, the travel photos, the small details that were part of our history. And suddenly, nothing had meaning anymore. Every object, every memory, was now a cruel reminder of the lie I was living. I wanted to destroy everything. Tear up the photos, break the furniture, erase every trace of her. But no. That would be too easy. I wanted something more. Something that would make her regret it. Something that would remind her, every day, that she threw away true love for a moment of fleeting pleasure. I picked up my cell phone again. I went to the photos I had received. Irrefutable proof. It wasn't just a case. It was something recurring. Something dirty, planned, hidden under my nose. I spent years of my life working, dedicating myself to this relationship, while she gave herself to another man. My stomach turned. Anger rose like an uncontrollable fire inside me. But the worst was yet to come. What no one expected, what even I couldn't predict, was what happened next. The betrayal itself was enough to destroy anyone. But what came next, the unfolding of this story, was what really shocked everyone. Because sometimes, fate has cruel ways of balancing things. And revenge can come in unexpected ways. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support betrayal under no circumstances. The stories told are fictitious, but show the devastating impact of infidelity, revealing how it destroys lives, families, and feelings. Betrayal is never the way, and the consequences always follow. Get ready for a story shocking, intense, and full of twists. Listen carefully, and reflect. The wedding of Daniel and Sarah. It was the type of relationship that many envied. Together for more than a decade, they had built an apparently perfect life, with a spacious house, unforgettable trips, and a complicity that seemed unshakable. He, a meticulous and dedicated man, has always been someone with a strong but balanced personality. He worked at a technology company, holding an important position that required many hours of his time, but he never stopped prioritizing his wife. He liked small gestures, affectionate notes left in the kitchen before leaving early for work, romantic dinners on the weekends, a long hug when he returned home after a tiring day. He was a man of strong principles, someone who took loyalty and commitment seriously. For him, trust was the foundation of any relationship, and with Sarah, there was never any doubt that that foundation was firm. Sarah was a woman of striking presence. Intelligent, charismatic, and engaging, she always knew how to transform the simplest moments into special ones. Working as an events coordinator, I was surrounded by parties, meetings, and constant social interactions. Contact with people from different places made her excited and made her social circle always active. Despite his busy life, he always valued marriage. Or, at least, that's what it seemed. The beginning of their relationship was intense, passionate, full of plans and expectations for the future. Sarah and Daniel had that connection that seemed otherworldly, that kind of harmony you saw in movies, where one understood the other without needing words. But time always takes its toll. The years passed, and the marriage, which was once full of enthusiasm, began to take on a predictable routine. The burning flame at the beginning turned into something warmer, more comfortable, but without the euphoria they had at the beginning. Daniel, caught up in the demands of his job, began to spend more time focused on his responsibilities, believing he was ensuring a solid future for both of them. Sarah, on the other hand, felt the dynamics of the relationship changing, even if she couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started to happen. The affectionate gestures were still there, but something seemed different. She didn't want to admit it, but there were moments when she felt alone, as if the passion that brought them together had remained somewhere in the past. Still, the two tried hard. Friday dinners remained a tradition, even if they were now accompanied by long periods of silence or conversations about work. Travel still took place, but without the sparkle it used to. When they were together, there was still love, but a love that now seemed worn out by routine, by obligations, by time. Sarah tried to ignore this feeling, convincing herself that it was normal, that all couples went through this. But deep down, an uneasiness was growing inside her. Daniel noticed that Sarah was different. She couldn't say exactly what it was, but she felt something hovering over her. There were moments when she seemed distant, lost in thought, staring into space. He tried to break down that invisible barrier that was installed between the two, starting a conversation, suggesting different programs, trying to revive what was once so intense. But she always had an excuse. The work, the tiredness, the lack of time. And he accepted it, even if something inside him warned him that it wasn't normal. The changes were subtle, but they were there. Sarah started spending more time on her cell phone, laughing at messages he didn't know were from. She started getting ready more often, choosing clothes she hadn't worn in a while, putting on perfume before leaving the house, something she rarely did for casual dinners. Daniel noticed, but refused to entertain any negative thoughts. He trusted her. Always trusted. There was no reason to doubt it. Their marriage was still strong. Or that's what he believed. When they were together, there were still good times, there were still laughs, there were still kisses and touches. But there was also an invisible gulf growing between them. Sarah seemed present, but at the same time, distant. She looked at Daniel, but her eyes no longer had that sparkle they used to have. In recent months, something began to bother Daniel more intensely. Small details that previously went unnoticed began to gain weight. Sarah's schedule was different. Work events that previously ended early now extended late into the night. The messages on her cell phone became more frequent, but when he walked by, she quickly blocked the screen. There was a certain nervousness about her, a greater care with her appearance, a strange anxiety before leaving for certain commitments. But Daniel didn't want to be paranoid. He always heard that the worst mistake in a marriage was unfounded distrust. He didn't want to be that controlling man, that jealous husband who saw things where they didn't exist. He wanted to believe that Sarah was the same woman he chose years ago, the one who promised to be by his side at all times. The days went on, and the discomfort only increased. One night, while Sarah slept next to him, Daniel looked at her, trying to find in his wife's face the same woman he fell in love with. What had changed? What was he missing? Was it just a phase? He didn't want to admit it to himself, but something inside him screamed that this restlessness wasn't just paranoia. But it was still too early to draw conclusions. Maybe it was just the stress of work. Maybe it was just the weight of the years together. Maybe it was just his mind creating scenarios that didn't exist. But what if it wasn't? The days passed, and the restlessness inside Daniel grew like a silent shadow, creeping between the empty spaces of the marriage that had once been his safe haven. Sarah continued to act as if everything was normal, but the details, those small, treacherous details, were there, staring him in the face. The cell phone always facing down, the muffled laughter while typing quick messages, the sudden changes in mood. There were nights when she dressed up more than usual, put on perfume with exaggerated care, analyzed her reflection in the mirror with a different look, as if she was looking for something beyond simple vanity. And when he asked where he was going, the answers were always vague, always the same excuses about work, the need to be present at events, the importance of maintaining contacts. Daniel wanted to believe. He tried. But the weight of doubt was a burden that crushed his chest. He began to observe her more closely, paying attention to the moments when she walked away to answer calls, to the sighs that escaped between her disguised smiles. The smell of a perfume that wasn't hers began to permeate her clothes when she returned late at night, and although she said it was the atmosphere of the events, something inside him screamed that it wasn't the complete truth. One night, she left earlier than usual, saying she had an important meeting with some work partners. Daniel watched her as she got ready. Fitted dress, impeccable makeup, a sparkle in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. But it wasn't for him. It wasn't for them. When she walked through the door, he felt a chill down his spine, an uncomfortable feeling that something was about to happen, that tonight would bring answers he didn't want, but needed to have. For long minutes, he stood still, looking at the closed door, the silence of the house amplifying his thoughts. Then, on an impulse he couldn't control, he grabbed his car keys and left. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, he didn't know if he really wanted to discover what his instinct was already telling him, but he needed to see it with his own eyes. He drove aimlessly for a while, until something made him stop in front of an elegant restaurant, one of those discreet places where couples met to escape the routine, where the dim light made everything more intimate, where looks weren't judged. Sarah's car was there. Daniel's heart raced, an electric current of anger and fear coursing through his body. He parked a distance away, watching the entrance. Time seemed to drag by, each minute heavier than the last. And then, he saw her. Sarah walked out of the restaurant, laughing, her eyes shining in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. But I wasn't alone. A man accompanied her, a little taller, a confident smile on his face. He touched her waist in a familiar, intimate way, something that made Daniel feel a bitter taste in his mouth. Blood boiled, breathing became irregular. I wanted to move forward, I wanted to confront them right there, I wanted to demand answers. But it stopped. She watched as the two headed to the parking lot, while she looked around to make sure no one saw them. The man opened the car door for her, and she got in without hesitation. Daniel felt the world spin. It was as if the ground had broken beneath his feet, as if reality was disintegrating before his eyes. Everything he refused to believe was there, happening right in front of him. He followed the car at a safe distance, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The path was short. The car parked in front of an inconspicuous building, and the two got out, walking side by side to the entrance. The way he held her hand, the way they laughed about something they shared, was a stab in Daniel's chest. He watched them disappear through the door of the building and stood there, staring at the unfolding truth like a cruel and inevitable scene. He didn't know how long he stayed there, looking at that closed door. His chest rose and fell in irregular breaths, his heart beating unsteadily. The pain of betrayal was suffocating, crushing, as if a weight was being hammered into his chest. He wanted to come in, he wanted to explode in anger, he wanted to demand that she explain, that she say something that made sense. But there was no explanation that could erase what he saw. The darkness of the night seemed to mock him, the silence around him amplifying the pain that burned inside him. Every detail of that scene would forever be engraved in his memory, every gesture, every look, every touch. He felt his hands shake as he picked up his cell phone. He dialed her number, putting the device to his ear. The sound of the ringing seemed to echo in his mind, each one a painful thump in his chest. And then, she answered. Her voice sounded normal, calm, but he knew. He felt the weight of the lie in every word she said. He took a deep breath, containing the storm that raged within him, and then said, with a coldness that he himself did not recognize in his voice, "The divorce is on the way." The silence on the other side was instantaneous. A silence filled with shock, fear, guilt. A silence that confirmed everything he needed to know. And at that moment, Daniel realized that that betrayal was just the beginning. What came next, no one was prepared to face. The phone was still glued to Daniel's ear when he heard a murmur on the other end. It was as if Sarah was trying to say something, but her voice wouldn't come out, suffocated by shock, by fear of the truth that was now reaching her with all the force of a hurricane. Daniel didn't hang up. I wanted to hear, I wanted to feel the impact of her every quick breath, every hesitation. The tension ran through the phone line, thick, as if it could be touched. Then he heard her whisper his name, hesitantly, as if still trying to find a way out of the inevitable. But there was no way out. The silence was broken by a sound in the background. A masculine murmur. Daniel didn't know if it was a whisper, a sigh, or some other noise, but it was enough to fuel his fury. His chest burned, every beat of his heart felt like an explosion. What he saw with his own eyes now materialized in his mind clearly. Sarah was not alone. The man was there, right there, in the same room, in the same space where he should have been the only one. Hatred blinded him, but next to him, something else grew. The need for answers. Her voice was shaky, weak, almost begging him not to do anything rash, for them to talk. But the time for conversation had already passed. The poison of betrayal was already spread, infiltrating every piece of what was left of their marriage. He hung up without another word. The weight of that moment suffocated him, but there was still something he didn't know. Something that would make everything he felt now seem small compared to what was to come. Sarah remained static, her cell phone still in her hand, her eyes wide, her skin cold. The man next to him shifted uneasily, trying to process what had just happened. He wasn't stupid. I knew that meant the end of everything. But unlike her, he didn't seem so desperate. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken fear, a doubt hovering between the two. And then, she broke the silence with a thin voice, looking at him as if looking for some reassurance. He knows everything. The man ran his hand through his hair, took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment. And then he simply said, "No. He still doesn't know everything." The terror that appeared on Sarah's face was immediate. Her chest rose and fell, her eyes opened even wider, and for a moment it seemed as if the ground disappeared beneath her feet. Daniel drove home without really seeing the way. His thoughts were in chaos, his heart was still beating angrily. When he arrived, he entered and stopped in the middle of the room, looking around. The once shared space, once home, was now a battlefield where he was the only survivor. The silence there was more deafening than any scream. Each memory turned into a blade cutting deep, and he felt the weight of each one. Hours passed. He didn't sleep. I couldn't. Dawn brought an even greater weight. Sarah hadn't come back yet. What else did he need to understand? He already knew. She had chosen. And then, the doorbell rang. Sarah was on the other side of the door. The red eyes, the pale skin. He didn't move a muscle, just stared at her. Time stretched between them, an impenetrable void. So, she took a deep breath and said she needed to talk. That I needed to tell the truth. He laughed. A bitter laugh, filled with disbelief. She had already told everything with her actions. But Sarah didn't blink, didn't back away. There was something there, a different insistence, an urgency that made him allow her entry. She entered, but did not sit down. He paced back and forth, his hands shaking, as if he was trying to find a way to say what he needed to say. He crossed his arms, waiting. What happened, Sarah? Haven't you done enough? She stopped, closed her eyes for a moment and then spoke, bluntly, without pauses. Daniel, the man you saw me with, he's not just a lover. He is my husband. The world stopped. Daniel felt as if his mind had failed, as if his brain refused to process those words. The sound echoed inside him, reverberating in an almost absurd way. His expression remained still for a few seconds, but then came confusion, followed by anger. What? Sarah swallowed hard, the tears now actually falling, but not from regret. Of fear. I never got divorced. When we met, when we started dating, I was already married. Daniel took a step back, as if the very air around him had turned toxic. The feeling of being betrayed, of being deceived for years, was overwhelming. Are you kidding me? Sarah shook her head quickly, desperately. I tried, Daniel, I tried to fix this. When I fell in love with you, I wanted to leave this marriage, but he never let me. He was always there, even without you knowing. The lump in Daniel's throat seemed to suffocate him. Every memory now had a new meaning, a new weight. She deceived him from day one. Their marriage was never real. All this time, I was another man. Sarah lowered her head, unable to look at him. Yes. The silence was absolute. But the hatred, resentment, and devastation Daniel felt could not be contained. His voice was sharp, filled with a pain he never imagined he would feel. You made me believe I was your only one. That we built a life together, that you were my wife, but all of that, was it a lie? She sobbed, desperate. It wasn't a lie. I loved you. I love you. He laughed, an empty, broken laugh. You don't know what love is, Sarah. You destroyed everything. She tried to get closer, but he backed away. And where was he all this time? Your husband. What was he doing while you were building a fake life with me? She hesitated, the truth weighing heavily in her mouth. He knew. I always knew. Daniel felt a wave of nausea. Did he know, and let him? Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with guilt. Because I was just one more. Like everyone else. She opened her mouth but couldn't respond. The silence was a confirmation. Daniel's pain turned into something new. Something much worse. He wasn't just betrayed. He was made a fool of. A piece in a game I never knew I was playing in. Sarah tried to hold his hand, beg for forgiveness, but Daniel pulled away. His gaze was now cold, distant. Something inside him had died. "Get out of my house." She hesitated, her lips trembling. "Daniel, please." He didn't scream. It didn't explode. He just repeated, his voice firm, irrefutable. "Skirt." And then, she knew there was nothing more to be said. Sarah turned and walked to the door. But before leaving, she took one last look at him. But Daniel didn't look back. And in that moment, something inside him changed forever. Sarah walked out the door, but the house still felt heavy with her presence, with the weight of everything that had been revealed. Daniel remained still, unmoving, trying to absorb the reality that now crushed every part of him. The air was thick, heavy, and his thoughts were mixed together in a disorderly whirlwind. The silence in the house, once comforting, was now suffocating. What should he do? Where should he go? Nothing seemed real. Nothing seemed to make sense. He walked to the kitchen, turned on the tap and washed his face, feeling the cold water run through his trembling fingers. But it was no use. The feeling of having been deceived did not go away. He looked around, seeing the furniture, the objects, every detail of the life he built, and realized that everything there was based on a lie. Every moment, every touch, every promise exchanged between him and Sarah, was never real. He was not her husband. It never was. Just a puppet in a game I never knew I was in. His cell phone vibrated on the table. He closed his eyes before picking it up, already knowing who it belonged to. He didn't need to look to know that Sarah would still try to talk to him, would still try to explain the unexplainable. But when she unlocked the screen, the name that appeared was not hers. The number was unknown. But he answered, because at that moment, nothing could surprise him anymore. Daniel, the voice was masculine, firm, but filled with something that he couldn't immediately identify. "I think we need to talk." He recognized it. It was him. The other. The real husband. Daniel gripped his cell phone tighter. His heart raced, his breathing became shorter. "I have nothing to talk to you about. But I do. And you will want to listen." Silence stretched between them. Daniel knew the last thing he wanted was to give this man more space in his life, but something in that voice stopped him from just hanging up. "Meet me at the Lancaster bar." The other man's voice was calm, almost indifferent. "I think you deserve to know everything." The call hung up before he could respond. Daniel looked at the phone, feeling a different anger rising within him. What kind of man was this? Who was this person who allowed his wife to lead a double life for years? And why the hell did he want to talk to Daniel now? Against all his better judgment, he took the car keys and left. The night was cold, the wind bit his skin as he walked to the entrance of the bar. The environment was dimly lit, with low ambient sound and a few people scattered around the place. He saw it immediately. The man sat at a table in the back, calmly watching the door, as if he already knew Daniel would appear. He approached slowly, feeling his body tense. The other man, tall, with a serious expression, looked up and indicated the chair in front of him. "Sit down." Daniel hesitated for a second, but pulled out the chair and sat down. His eyes were fixed on that unknown face, trying to find any trace of guilt, of remorse, of anything that would explain why he was there, why he had allowed all this to happen. The other took a deep breath and took a sip of the drink before speaking. "I know what you're thinking. I know this all sounds absurd." Daniel clenched his fists on the table. "It does not seem. It's absurd. You knew it all along, didn't you?" The man nodded slowly. "Yes." Daniel felt a wave of fury go through him, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. "Then why the hell did you let this happen?" The other looked at him, his eyes carried a shadow of something that Daniel couldn't define. "Because Sarah wasn't the first." The words were spoken with disturbing calm. Daniel frowned, confused. "What does that mean?" The man rested his elbows on the table, interlacing his fingers. Sarah has done this before. Several times. You were just one more. Daniel blinked, feeling an icy shiver run down his spine. What? Sarah has this pattern. She meets a man, builds a fake life with him, keeps everything secret, makes him believe he's everything to her, and then, when the truth starts to get closer, she just disappears. Daniel was speechless. You weren't the first, Daniel. And I tell you this because I was once you. The silence between them was absolute. The man took another sip of his drink before continuing. When I met Sarah, she was already married. I didn't know, of course. She did to me exactly what she did to you. Created a life, made me believe I was the only one. And then one day, I discovered that I was just a pawn in a game she had been playing for years. Daniel felt the weight of the words fall on him like a wall collapsing. She deceived you too. The other laughed bitterly. We were all deceived. You, me, and others before us. Daniel ran his hands over his face, trying to process the information. And why did you stay? Why did you allow this? The man looked at him, his eyes filled with something dark. Because I wanted to see how far she would go. Daniel felt a chill. Like this? I wanted to see how far she was capable of taking this charade. And I wanted to see how many of us there were. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a crushing weight on him. And how many were there? The other hesitated for a moment, then replied, 6. Daniel lost his breath. 6. Sarah did this 6 times. He created 6 lives, deceived 6 men, constructed 6 parallel stories. His stomach turned. What was she, anyway? Who was the woman he loved for so many years? I discovered them all, continued the other man, but I didn't say anything. I let her continue because I wanted to see where this would end. Now do you understand why I called you here? Daniel looked at him, still in shock. You wanted me to know, yes. Because now that you know the truth, you need to decide what you're going to do with it. Silence hung over the table for long seconds. Daniel felt his heart heavy, his breathing uneven. He didn't know the answer. Not yet. But I knew that the life I had up until that moment, had ended there. The weight of the revelation still hung on Daniel's shoulders like a storm about to break. Every word spoken by the man sitting in front of him echoed inside him, like hammers against the already fragile structure of his sanity. 6. 6 men who had been through exactly what he was going through now. 6 lives built on a lie, on skillful manipulation, where Sarah spun her web and entangled each of them with the same precision. What made her someone like that? What was the motivation behind this sick game? Daniel couldn't say how long he had been there, with his eyes fixed on the glass in front of him without really seeing it. The conversation had been one blow after another, and even though the fury still burned inside him, there was something bigger taking hold now. An emptiness. An overwhelming feeling that his entire life was nothing more than an illusion. The man before him said nothing more. He just watched, as if he knew Daniel would need time to absorb everything. Perhaps he expected some more explosive reaction, a scream, an aggression, something that would relieve that invisible pressure that hung in the air. But Daniel did not give him this pleasure. His mind worked too fast, mixing memories and realities until nothing seemed to make sense anymore. Finally, he stood up. The other man followed him with his gaze, but didn't try to stop him. What are you going to do? His voice finally broke the silence. Daniel paused for a moment, without responding immediately. What could he do? Sue Sarah legally? Expose your scam to everyone? Find the other 5 men and find some kind of collective revenge? None of these options seemed enough to heal the wound that throbbed in his chest. I don't know, was all he managed to say before turning his back and leaving the bar. The cold night air enveloped him as he walked through the door, but it failed to ease the lump in his throat. His head hurt, his stomach was churning, his hands were still shaking. He walked aimlessly, trying to organize his thoughts. Everything inside him wanted an answer, something that justified what Sarah did, but there was no logic in behavior like that. He stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the dark sky, feeling the crushing weight of what he had discovered. The world around him continued normally, people walked, cars passed, the city pulsed as if nothing had happened. But for him, everything had changed. He didn't know who he was anymore. His identity, his history, his memories, everything was contaminated by the lie. Not knowing where to go, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he never thought he needed. When the voice answered on the other end, Daniel took a few seconds to respond. "I need to find you. Now." The response was quick. Sarah was still waiting for him to make contact. Minutes later, he parked in front of the house where she was. His heart was beating hard, but not for the reason it once beat when he saw her. Now, it was hate, it was contempt, it was a visceral need to understand. He got out of the car and walked to the door, which opened before he could even knock. Sarah was there, pale, her eyes teary, but not with regret. It was fear. She felt afraid because she knew that this time, there were no more lies to cling to. He entered without asking permission, without looking around. The place where she was small, discreet, a rented apartment with none of the traces of the house they once shared. "You came," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel stared at her for a long time before responding. "You did this 6 times. Sarah froze. Her expression immediately changed. His eyes widened, his body went rigid. "You spoke to him." "I spoke." She took a step back, as if simple distance could protect her from the impact of her own actions. "Daniel, I can explain." He laughed. An empty, humorless laugh. "You can. Because I'd really like to hear how you're going to explain the fact that you were never my wife. That while I thought we had a life, a story, you were just playing." Sarah covered her face with her hands, as if she could escape reality. "I tried." "What did you try, Sarah? Did you try to keep up the charade any longer? Did you try to trick me more? Did you love them all too? Did you say the same words to each of us?" She sobbed, unable to respond. I don't know why I do this." Daniel felt his chest tighten. She didn't even have a justification. No explanation that could even serve as a remedy for the damage he caused. "You destroyed us. 6 men who thought they were building something real. Do you have any idea what this means?" She raised her head, her eyes red. "I didn't want to hurt you." He slammed his hand on the table, making her wince. "But it hurt. It finished me. You took away any trace of truth from me." Sarah collapsed. He fell onto the couch, crying as if all the guilt in the world had finally fallen on his shoulders. But Daniel didn't feel sorry. There was no room for pity within him. He ran his hands through his hair, taking a deep breath. "I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to go on after today." Sarah looked at him desperately. "Please forgive me." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting that phrase echo inside him. Forgiveness. As if it were simple. As if erasing everything was just a matter of will. Then, he opened his eyes and looked at her for the last time. "No." And then, he left. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for more justifications, more requests, more lies. He just walked out and closed the door, leaving behind the weight of a story that was never his. And for the first time since it all started, he felt like maybe he was ready to start over. Daniel left that house and felt the cold night air hit his face, but this time it wasn't a shock, it was a relief. The door closed behind him, and with it, all the charade he carried in his chest. His steps were steady, but within him there was still uncontrollable chaos. The city seemed to carry on as normal, indifferent to the fact that its life had been shattered. He walked to the car, opened the door and got behind the wheel, but did not start the engine. He stood there, looking into space, trying to find a shred of clarity in the midst of the storm. What should I do now? Where would you go? Thoughts ran over each other, accumulated without giving space for any breath. The truth about Sarah was greater than anything she had ever imagined. For years he lived a lie, believing his marriage was real, that his choices were solid, that the love they shared was genuine. But none of that ever existed. He was just another one on her list. A disposable piece, a purposeless emotional experiment. His cell phone vibrated in the passenger seat. He closed his eyes for a moment before looking at the screen. It wasn't Sarah. It was a number he recognized immediately. The man who sat across from him at the bar, the one who knew Sarah better than he knew himself. The real husband. Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "You spoke to her," was the first thing the man said, without needing confirmation. "Yes." A brief silence fell before the next response came. "I imagined you would do that." Daniel had no patience for beating around the bush. "What do you want?" "To know how you are." Daniel's laugh was short, bitter, almost cynical. "How am I? Do you really want to know?" "Yes. Because I've been where you are now. And I know there is no easy way out." Daniel passed his hand over his face, feeling the weight of the words. "Do you want to know how I am? I'm ruined. I don't know what to do with this truth, I don't know how to move on, I don't know what the time I spent with her means, if anything." The man sighed on the other end of the line. "It never completely goes away. But over time, you learn to live with it. Coexist. How did you manage to live with that?" The other's voice became more serious. "I didn't say I did it. I just moved on. You have two choices now, either hold on to it and let it destroy what's left of you, or learn to let go." The words seemed simple, but they had an enormous weight. "And you? Did you let go?" The silence that followed answered more than any words could. Daniel took a deep breath. "I don't want to talk about it anymore." "Then don't talk. But listen. Sarah will try to come back." He closed his eyes, feeling a shiver run down his spine. "I know. And what are you going to do when that happens?" Daniel didn't respond. "Think carefully before deciding. She will promise you changes, she will beg you, she will tell you that you are different, that it was real. But if you accept it, you will only be entering the same cycle that so many others have entered before you." Daniel gripped the steering wheel. "I never want to see her again. I hope you stick to that decision. But if you change your mind, remember what I said." The call dropped. Daniel looked at the phone, letting it slide into the passenger seat. His head throbbed. I needed to get out of there. He needed to drive aimlessly until he found a place where the weight of it all wouldn't reach him. He turned the key in the ignition, feeling the engine growl low, as if the car also knew that the night would never end. He drove without a destination. The streets passed by like blurs in his vision, but no matter where he went, the pain remained with him. The past was still with him. Until, without realizing it, he stopped in front of a place he hadn't visited in years. "The park where I used to go when I needed to think." He turned off the car, got out and walked to one of the seats, sitting down. The night was silent, the wind was blowing lightly, and for a moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Then, a sound of soft footsteps caught his attention. He looked to the side and saw someone approaching. A woman. She hesitated when she saw him there, but then smiled shyly, recognizing him. "Daniel?" He blinked, surprised to recognize Livia, an old college friend. They hadn't seen each other in years. She looked different, but at the same time, the same as the memory he had. "Livia." She tilted her head, studying his expression. "What are you doing here at this time?" He laughed lightly, without humor. I think I needed air. She sat down next to him, without asking anything else. They stayed there, in silence, for minutes. Until she spoke again. You look exhausted. Daniel looked at her. Unlike Sarah, Livia had a sincere, real look. I am. She smiled slightly. Do you want to talk? Daniel didn't know if he wanted to. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like someone was actually willing to listen to him. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step in moving forward. Daniel sat on the park bench for a long time. The conversation with Livia had been a breather in the midst of the chaos, but he knew he still had a lot to process. It wasn't just about Sarah. It wasn't just about the lies. It was about him. About what he would do from that moment on. For years, he believed he was building a solid, secure life, but now he realized that this security never existed. He wondered how many other things in his life were false, how many times he ignored signs that had been there all along, screaming at him to see the truth. But seeing the truth is not always easy. The following days were strange. He didn't answer any more calls from Sarah, he didn't respond to her messages, he didn't allow himself to be dragged back into a cycle that he now understood to be destructive. However, I knew it wasn't that simple. She was not the type of person who gave up easily. And he was right. One night, while walking home, he saw a car parked near his garage. His chest contracted as he recognized who was there, standing, waiting. Sarah got out of the car as soon as she saw him, her eyes red, her face haggard. She was different. For the first time, he didn't see the woman who manipulated him with sweet words and well-calculated gestures. He saw someone who was on the verge of despair, someone who no longer knew where to run. We need to talk, his voice was low, almost a whisper. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath. He could simply ignore her, go into the house and put away any trace of what had once existed between them. But something inside him, perhaps a remnant of humanity, made him stop. He didn't want to get back together, he didn't want to hear her beg for something that was already dead, but he wanted to understand. She walked towards him, hesitantly. I have no one but you. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. You have a husband. Or rather, there were several. She looked away, biting her lower lip, visibly upset. I don't know why I did it, Daniel. I tried to stop, I swear I tried, but it always happened again. I was looking for something, and when I found it, it was no longer enough. So I looked again. He crossed his arms, staring at her. And now? What are you looking for? She ran her hands over her face, breathing hard. I just wanted to go back in time. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest, but it wasn't compassion. It was tiredness. There is no going back. You know that. Sarah looked up at him, and for a moment, she looked like a completely different person than the one he knew. There was no more control in his words, no more manipulation. Just a frightening emptiness. So what do I do now? Daniel hesitated. As much as he knew the simplest answer would be to say, it's not my problem, he couldn't. But he couldn't save her either. You need to deal with the consequences of what you did. We all need it. She smiled, a sad, defeated smile. I lost everything, didn't I? He didn't respond. He just looked at her, hoping she would understand on her own. Sarah looked down at the floor, took a step back, and nodded slowly. I'm leaving. He didn't ask where. She got into the car and drove away without looking back. And he knew, in that moment, that he would never see her again. Time passed. The pain did not disappear, but it changed shape. It became a learning experience, a reminder of everything he didn't want to be, everything he didn't want to allow into his life again. He began to rebuild little by little, without rushing, without unrealistic expectations. Some nights were still difficult, some thoughts still haunted him, but he was no longer their prisoner. Livia appeared unexpectedly in his life, but not in the way Sarah appeared. Not with empty promises, not with illusions of perfect love. She appeared with her sincerity, with her patience, with the calmness of someone who didn't try to rush anything. And that was exactly what he needed. One day, as they walked through the park where they met again, she held his hand and smiled. "Do you still think about her?" He hesitated for a moment before responding. "Less than yesterday." She nodded, understanding. "That's a good start." Daniel looked at her, feeling for the first time in a long time that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to move on. Sarah was never seen again. She disappeared from the city, leaving no trace. Some people heard rumors that he had moved to another state, but no one knew for sure. It was as if it had never existed, as if it were just a ghost in the memories of those left behind. Daniel knew he would never have all the answers. Some truths are never fully revealed, some wounds never fully heal. But he also knew that moving forward was the only choice he had. And this time, he would choose right. "Now that you've come this far, I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Did you imagine that betrayal would reach this proportion? Leave your comment. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. Betrayal destroys lives, and consequences always come. Until next time.